It is therefore ordered that you shall be put to death by electrocution in the mode prescribed by law. That you shall be transferred to custody for order. Your body shall be subjected to shock by sufficient current of electricity. May God have mercy on you.
Can I please have a home before I get out?
Mr. Bates, your children's Pike and Docs.
Please, let me just have a home.
Please hold on.
I love you. I love you.
She kept a piece of her victim's skull in her jacket pocket. And the next morning, she showed it off in the cafeteria, laughing, while the girl she murdered was still lying in the woods, waiting to be found. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications because stories like this remind us that truth can be stranger than fiction. This is the story of how a 19-year-old girl, searching for a second chance at life, walked into the woods one freezing night in January and never walked back out. It is the story of jealousy that curdled into obsession, and obsession that curdled into something far darker. And it is the story of the woman who did it. A woman who, more than 30 years later, is still sitting in a cell in Tennessee, waiting for a date that has finally, after 3 decades of delay, been set in stone. To understand how any of this happened, you first have to understand where it happened. In 1995, the Job Corps Center in Knoxville, Tennessee, was supposed to be a lifeline. It was a federally funded program, born out of the 1960s, designed to catch teenagers before they fell through the cracks of American society. If you had dropped out of high school, if you had grown up in poverty, if you carried a minor juvenile record and nowhere else to go, Job Corps offered you a door. Behind that door were dormitories, meals, a small stipend, and the promise of a trade: carpentry, culinary arts, office administration. On paper, it was a place where broken starts could be rebuilt. From the outside, the Knoxville campus looked almost like a strict boarding school. Uniforms, curfews, security guards patrolling long fluorescent-lit hallways. But peel back that orderly surface, and you would find something far more volatile. Hundreds of teenagers, many of them carrying deep, unresolved trauma, crammed together in close quarters, far from home, far from anyone who truly knew them. Fights broke out. Cliques formed overnight and dissolved just as fast. Contraband moved quietly through the dormitories after lights out. For some students, this place became the turning point that saved their lives. For others, it became something else entirely. A stage. Colleen Slemmer wanted the better life. She was 19 years old, and she had traveled all the way from Orange Park, Florida, chasing a fresh start. Growing up, school had never come easily to her. She had spent years in special education classes, and after graduation, she struggled to find solid ground. Her mother, May Martinez, believed Job Corps could give her daughter something she had never quite had: structure, stability, a future. So Colleen packed a bag. She boarded a bus, and she came to Tennessee to study computer science, hoping to land a quiet desk job one day. A steady paycheck, something to make her mother proud. People who knew her described her the same way, again and again. Quiet, trusting, a little naive in the way that kind people sometimes are. She did not like conflict. When someone pushed, she folded rather than pushed back. In a place like Job Corps, where the social hierarchy could turn vicious overnight, that gentleness made her something dangerous to be. It made her a target. And the person who would turn her into one had already arrived on campus, carrying an entirely different set of instincts. Her name was Christa Pike, and by the time this story truly begins, she was already someone other students had learned to fear. Christa Pike was born in 1976 in West Virginia, and her childhood was, by almost every account, chaotic. Raised largely by her grandmother, she grew up surrounded by instability and exposure to substance abuse. She dropped out of high school. She picked up a minor arrest record, including a shoplifting charge. Eventually, like Colleen, she landed at the Knoxville Job Corps Center, sent there to earn her GED. But her background alone does not explain what came next. Plenty of teenagers arrived at that campus carrying similarly painful histories. Christa Pike was different in how she chose to wear hers. When she walked the halls, people noticed. and they got out of her way. She picked fights over almost nothing. A glance held a second too long in the cafeteria line was enough to set her off. She liked watching people back down. Former roommates would later describe the way she laughed after threatening someone. An easy, delighted laugh, as if intimidation was simply entertainment to her. It was never only about anger. It was about control, about being the person everyone else feared. Somewhere along the way, Pike began dating a 17-year-old student named Ship. Ship had his own dark fascinations. He wore a heavy pentagram necklace. He kept a small, makeshift altar in his dorm room. He liked to talk about death, about the occult, about violence in a way that unsettled the people around him. Rather than being pulled back from that darkness, Pike leaned into it. She adopted his obsessions as her own, determined to prove she could be even more ruthless than he was. Together with an 18-year-old friend named Peterson, the three of them formed a tight, intimidating little circle. They walked the halls as a unit. They broke curfew together. They made other students nervous just by entering a room. Pike wanted to be the single most feared person on that campus. And soon she decided she had found the perfect way to prove it. There was no real reason behind what happened next. No deep grievance. No long simmering conflict. Christa Pike simply decided, almost on a whim, that Colleen Slevin was trying to steal her boyfriend. Rumors spread through the dormitories that Colleen had been flirting with Ship. Other students later testified to a very different truth. Colleen was actually afraid of Ship. She avoided him whenever she could. She wanted absolutely nothing to do with him, his necklace, his altar, or his obsession with the occult. But the facts never mattered to Christa Pike. In her mind, Colleen had become a threat, a challenge to her authority. And that was enough. It started small, the way these things almost always do. Name-calling in the cafeteria, a shove in a crowded hallway, whispered threats in the dormitory at night. Colleen did not fight back. She kept her eyes down. She told herself that if she simply endured it, ignored it, waited it out, it would eventually stop. It did not stop. If anything, her silence only fed the fire. Pike stopped wanting to merely frighten her. She began to want something far more permanent. She stopped hiding her intentions from her small, loyal circle. She told Ship and Peterson plainly that she wanted to hurt Colleen. She told them she wanted to kill her. And here is the detail that should chill you more than almost anything else in this story. Neither Ship nor Peterson reported it. Not to campus security. Not to an instructor. Not even a quiet warning slipped to Colleen herself, telling her to run, to be careful, to sleep somewhere else that night. Instead, the two of them helped Christa Pike build the trap that would kill her. Pike understood that a direct attack inside the dormitories would never work. There were too many witnesses. Security patrolled too closely. She needed to get Colleen alone. Somewhere far from cameras, far from guards, far from anyone who might hear a scream. So on the evening of Thursday, January 12, 1995, Christa Pike found Colleen in the dormitory and did something that must have felt, to Colleen, like a miracle. She dropped the hostility. Her voice softened. She told Colleen she was tired of the tension between them. She said she wanted to call a truce. And then she extended an invitation. Come with us, she said. Sneak out after curfew. Smoke a little marijuana in the woods. Peace offering, nothing more. Colleen said yes. Imagine, for a moment, what that must have felt like to her. Months of quiet dread, of flinching every time Pike walked past, suddenly lifting. She thought the nightmare was finally ending. She thought she could go back to focusing on her classes, on her future, without looking over her shoulder every time she turned a corner. She had no idea she was walking directly into her own murder. Around 8 o'clock that night, with temperatures in Knoxville dropping close to freezing, Colleen pulled on her winter coat and followed Christa Pike, Ship, and Peterson out of the dormitories and off the Job Corps property. They walked past greenhouses, past streetlights, past the last visible edges of campus, toward the University of Tennessee's agricultural land, until the buildings disappeared behind them and there was nothing left but trees. They stopped at a wooded ravine, isolated, silent, dark enough that nothing happening there would be seen by anyone. Colleen thought they had stopped to smoke. She had no idea the trap had just closed shut around her. What happened over the next 45 minutes is almost too brutal to narrate without pausing to breathe. The moment they were out of sight of the road, Pike and Ship turned on Colleen. Fists, kicks. When she collapsed to the frozen dirt, they dragged her deeper into the brush, away from any chance of being seen. Colleen tried to run. She clawed her way up the embankment, desperate, terrified, only to be pulled back down every single time. Then Pike produced 2 weapons she had stolen earlier from the Job Corps commercial kitchen. A box cutter, a meat cleaver. She used them on Colleen's arms, her legs, her face. Ship held her down so she could not fight back, could not shield herself, could not do anything except endure it. And in an act pulled straight from Ship's obsession with the occult, the 2 of them carved a pentagram directly into Colleen's chest while she was still alive. Meanwhile, Shadala Peterson stood at the edge of the clearing, watching the tree line, making absolutely sure that no passing security guard, no university police officer, no random late-night jogger would stumble upon what was happening in those woods. Colleen begged them to stop. She asked them, again and again, why they were doing this to her. She pleaded for her life. They did not stop. Finally, when Colleen lay motionless on the frozen ground, barely breathing, Christa Pike walked away from her, scanning the dirt as if searching for something specific. She found it, a heavy, discarded chunk of asphalt. She picked it up. She walked back to where Colleen lay, and she brought it down hard onto her head. The blow killed Colleen Slemmer instantly. For a moment, the 3 of them simply stood there in the dark, looking down at what they had done. And then Christa Pike did something that would haunt this case for the next 30 years. She knelt down. She picked up a fragment of Colleen's shattered skull. She wiped it off. She slipped it into the pocket of her winter jacket, and she zipped the pocket shut. Then the 3 of them turned, walked out of the woods, and slipped quietly back into their dormitory beds, as if nothing had happened at all. Most killers try to disappear into the crowd after what they've done. They hide. They panic. They cover their tracks. Christa Pike did the opposite. And what she did next is, in many ways, even more disturbing than the murder itself. The next morning, the Job Corps campus moved through its usual rhythm. Instructors took attendance. Colleen's name went unanswered. Campus security began making routine phone calls, the kind that happen every time a student misses a morning check-in, still without any real sense of alarm. And while all of that was happening, Christa Pike was sitting in the cafeteria. She was not hiding. She was not nervous. She was not glancing at the door. She reached into her jacket pocket, and she pulled out the piece of Colleen's skull, and she showed it to the other students sitting at her table. She laughed while she did it. She described the assault in detail. 45 minutes of it. The blades, the pentagram, the asphalt. She treated the fragment of bone like a trophy, something to be admired, something that proved exactly how far she was willing to go. She believed, completely, that fear would keep every single person at that table silent. She was wrong. Within 36 hours of the murder, the Knoxville Police Department received an anonymous phone call. A terrified student, unable to carry the weight of what they had heard, told detectives everything. Who had killed the missing girl, how they had done it, where the killers were sleeping that very night. Detectives moved fast. They drove straight to the Job Corps campus, bypassed the administration offices entirely, and pulled Christa Pike, Tatterall Ship, and Shadala Peterson directly out of their daily routines. All 3 were brought in for questioning. Inside the interrogation room, investigators braced themselves for denial, for a demand for a lawyer, for silence. Instead, Christa Pike waived her Miranda rights entirely. She sat down across from detectives, and she confessed. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with, "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this shocking story. The recording of that confession still exists, and what makes it so unsettling is not what Pike said, but how she said it. Her voice does not break. She does not cry. She walks detectives through the entire sequence of events in a calm, almost clinical tone. The slashing, the carving of the pentagram, the moment she dropped the asphalt onto Colleen's head, When investigators asked her why, her answer was almost disturbingly simple. She said Colleen had been acting tough, and she wanted to show her who was really tougher. Detectives noted something else, too, something that stayed with them long after the interview ended. Christa Pike never once asked about Colleen's family. She never asked whether her victim had survived, whether she had suffered, whether there was anything that could still be done. Her attention, from beginning to end, remained fixed almost entirely on herself. Search warrants followed quickly. Investigators recovered blood-soaked clothing from the dormitories. They found the meat cleaver. They found the box cutter. And in Pike's jacket pocket, exactly where she had left it, they found the fragment of Colleen's skull. All three teenagers were arrested and charged with first-degree murder. News of the killing tore through Knoxville. For weeks, it dominated local headlines. A case so brutal, so senseless, that it seemed to defy explanation. In early 1996, Christa Pike stood trial. The prosecution did not need to lean on circumstantial evidence or speculation. They had the murder weapons. They had the physical evidence recovered from the dormitories. And they had Pike's own voice, calm and unwavering, admitting to every detail of the crime. During the trial, that confession tape was played for the jury in open court. In the gallery sat Mae Martinez, Colleen's mother, forced to listen as her daughter's killer described the murder in flat, unbothered detail. Forced to hear Pike laugh on that recording. It is difficult to imagine a more devastating moment for a parent to endure. Pike's defense attorneys argued that she was, in many ways, a product of the trauma she had grown up with. They pointed to her chaotic childhood, to years of neglect, to mental health struggles that had never been properly treated. They argued that her brain had been shaped by that damage in ways that limited her ability to fully grasp the weight of what she had done. The jury did not accept it. They looked at the premeditation, the fake peace offering, designed specifically to lure Colleen into the woods. The 45 minutes the assault lasted. This was not a moment of impulsive rage. This was something planned, sustained, and carried out with total control. It took the jury only a few hours to return a verdict. Guilty, on charges of first-degree murder and conspiracy. On March 30th, 1996, the judge handed down her sentence. At just 20 years old, Christa Pike became the youngest woman on death row anywhere in the United States. Her accomplices faced very different outcomes. Tatterall Shipp had been 17 at the time of the murder, a juvenile under the law, which made him legally ineligible for the death penalty. He was sentenced instead to life in prison with the possibility of parole. Shadala Peterson, who had acted only as a lookout and who cooperated fully with investigators, was offered a plea deal. She pled guilty to being an accessory after the fact. She received probation. She served no prison time at all, and eventually she walked free. For Colleen's family, that disparity was almost impossible to accept. Mae Martinez spent the following decades attending every single appeal hearing, every parole board meeting, refusing to let the state, or anyone else, forget what had happened to her daughter. Most people assume that a death sentence marks the end of a story. For Christa Pike, it was only the beginning of a much longer, much stranger chapter. One that would stretch across 3 decades and reveal a woman who had lost none of her capacity for manipulation, violence, and control. Pike was transferred to the Deborah K. Johnson Rehabilitation Center in Nashville, the state's facility for women, where she became and remained the only woman on Tennessee's death row. Under the tightest security the state could offer, you might expect a person in her position to fade quietly into the background of prison life. Christa Pike did not fade. In August of 2001, she approached a fellow inmate named Patricia Jones. She wrapped a shoelace around Jones's neck and attempted to strangle her to death, right there inside the prison unit. Correctional officers managed to intervene before Jones died. Pike was tried and convicted of attempted murder, adding still more time onto a sentence that, by then, would likely never be served in full anyway. But violence was never her only weapon. Somewhere along the way, prison investigators noticed a pattern forming, one built not on force, but on charm. From behind bars, Pike began writing letters to men on the outside. Some were admirers who had followed her case. Others had never met her at all before that first letter arrived. In those letters, she painted herself as misunderstood, as a victim of a justice system that had failed to see who she truly was. Some of the men who received those letters came to believe Pike loved them. Others began sending her money. At least one man became convinced he was corresponding with an innocent woman, wrongly condemned. According to investigators, Pike had a talent for telling each person exactly what they most wanted to hear. And those relationships were never simply about companionship. Some of them became part of something far more calculated. A long, patient effort to find her way out of prison entirely. One of those relationships would eventually pull in an outside accomplice and, remarkably, a correctional officer working inside her own facility, in a plan that came astonishingly close to breaking her out of a maximum security prison for women. It began in 2012, when Pike set her sights on a male correctional officer named Donald Damist, who worked directly within her housing unit. In any prison, guards and inmates cross paths daily. Lines blur. Words are exchanged that should never be exchanged. Slowly, deliberately, Pike drew Damist into what became a romantic relationship. Notes passed quietly between them. Conversations held in the moments when no other guard was watching. And over time, she convinced him to help her bypass the facility's secure doors. But an inside man alone was not enough. She needed someone waiting on the outside, too. Through her wide network of pen pals, Pike connected with a man from New Jersey named Justin Heflin. Using a contraband cell phone that had been smuggled into her cell, she began orchestrating the plan in far greater detail than anyone might have expected from someone locked inside the most secure women's facility in the state. According to investigators, every role had already been assigned by the time the plot was discovered. Heflin was instructed to travel to Tennessee, to secure a getaway vehicle, and to acquire weapons. Damist, from the inside, was expected to provide a duplicate key or leave specific security doors unlocked during a shift he had carefully arranged to work. Once Pike made it outside the walls, Heflin would be waiting to drive her away, out of Tennessee, out of the reach of the state that had spent 17 years trying to execute her. The plan progressed for months. Money changed hands. Damist fed Pike detailed information about guard rotations and security routines, piece by piece, tightening the plan closer to something that might actually work. But somewhere along the way they made mistakes. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation intercepted their communications. Undercover agents quietly began monitoring the money transfers, tracking Heflin's movements, listening to the phone calls flowing in and out of that contraband cell phone. They let the plan develop just far enough, just long enough to build an airtight case and secure indictments against everyone involved. Then, before the escape could ever be carried out, law enforcement moved in. Donald Damist was arrested and fired from his position. Justin Heflin was apprehended. Pike's cell was raided, and the phone that had made the entire plot possible was finally seized. The investigation revealed something almost impossible to comprehend. Nearly 20 years after her conviction, locked inside one of the most secure facilities in the entire state, Christa Pike had still found a way to actively coordinate criminal activity from within her own cell. In the aftermath, prison officials placed her in extreme isolation, a security response that stretched on for years. Her legal team eventually filed a lawsuit, arguing that the isolation amounted to unconstitutional solitary confinement. In late 2024, the state settled, granting her slightly more time outside her cell. But that legal victory, small as it was, arrived just as a far larger and more permanent legal battle was beginning to close in around her. For years, the machinery of capital punishment in Tennessee had effectively ground to a halt. Executions were paused after the state faced intense scrutiny over its lethal injection protocols. Following a string of troubled executions between 2018 and 2020, the governor ordered a full review. The death chamber sat empty, unused, while officials worked to determine what, if anything, could be fixed. That review is now complete. The Tennessee Department of Corrections revised its execution protocols. The state secured the lethal drugs it needed, and the Attorney General's office began aggressively working through the backlog of death row inmates who had exhausted every standard avenue of appeal available to them. Christa Pike was placed at the very top of that list. On September 30th, 2025, the Tennessee Supreme Court granted the state's request and set a firm execution date. September 30th, 2026. If it is carried out, Christa Pike will become the first woman executed in the state of Tennessee in over 2 centuries. Faced, for the first time, with an actual date on the calendar, Pike's defense attorneys launched what may be their final legal campaign. They continue petitioning the governor directly for clemency, asking him to commute her sentence to life in prison without parole. They argue that executing a person for a crime committed at 18 years old runs contrary to modern scientific understanding of brain development at that age. They point again and again to the stark disparity between her sentence and the one handed to Tatterall Shipp, who committed the same crime beside her and will, one day, be eligible for release. But the centerpiece of their current fight is a civil rights lawsuit filed in January of 2026, one that has nothing to do with guilt or innocence, and everything to do with how, exactly, the state intends to kill her. Tennessee's revised protocol now relies on a single drug method, a dose of pentobarbital, to induce death. Pike's lawsuit argues that this method constitutes cruel and unusual punishment under the 8th Amendment. Her attorneys claim she suffers from a documented medical condition affecting her blood, one that they say will cause a reaction known as flash pulmonary edema if she is injected with the drug. In plain terms, they argue her lungs will rapidly fill with fluid. Her legal team claims this will cause her to experience the sensation of drowning while strapped to the execution gurney, moments before the drug ever stops her heart. The state flatly denies this. Attorneys representing Tennessee argue that the protocol is both legally sound and medically humane. And they point to something else entirely, a strange legal technicality buried in the state's own statutes. Because Christa Pike committed her crime before January 1, 1999, Tennessee law gives her a choice that most modern death row inmates simply do not have. She has the legal right to select the electric chair instead of lethal injection. The state's position is direct. If she genuinely fears the drug protocol, the alternative is sitting right there in front of her. The courts are now reviewing these exact arguments. The Attorney General's office insists that the time for appeals has run out, that COLLEEN SLEVIN's family has waited 30 years for this sentence to finally be carried out. They point directly to the 2001 strangulation attempt and the 2012 escape plot as living proof that Christa Pike cannot be safely managed, even inside the walls of maximum security. If the federal courts dismiss her pentobarbital lawsuit, one of her last remaining legal avenues will close for good, and the state will be cleared to proceed. Job Corps was built on a single, hopeful idea, that a change of environment could change the entire trajectory of a young person's life. For COLLEEN SLEVIN, it was supposed to be the beginning of something new, a chance to leave behind a difficult childhood and finally build a future she could be proud of. For Christa Pike, that same campus became something else entirely. The place where, at 18 years old, she committed a crime so calculated, so brutal, that it would come to define every single year that followed. More than 30 years after COLLEEN SLEVIN walked into those woods believing, with her whole trusting heart, that a painful feud had finally come to an end, the state of Tennessee is now preparing to carry out the sentence a jury handed down in 1996. Whether that execution ultimately happens will be decided in a courtroom, in the coming months, by judges weighing arguments about drugs and pain and constitutional rights. But the facts of what happened in that ravine on a freezing night in January are no longer in question. A 19-year-old girl came to Job Corps looking for a second chance at life. She never got the chance to use it. And no ruling, no appeal, no verdict handed down now, decades later, can ever give her back the life that was taken from her in those woods. If the story shocked you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. There are many more unbelievable true stories waiting for you here.